We're joined now by CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David is also a New York Times White House and national security correspondent. David, good to see you. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. A week ago,
Good Thanksgiving to you too.
Thank you. A week ago, the U.S. and Ukrainian teams were meeting in Geneva, as we heard Marco Rubio talking about there. Now we have these talks today, and we're looking ahead to a full week as well with more discussions just across the world, really. What is your sense of if we are actually getting any closer to a deal?
Well, I think they're getting closer to an understanding with the Ukrainians, but getting to a deal means taking all of this to President Putin and getting Russia's agreement. And the more that you move that early draft that leaked a week ago toward Ukraine, that obviously had been quite pro-Russian, the harder it is to get Putin to sign on. I'm relatively confident, Jessica, that they're going to work out the land issue. Because, there you can sort of define the boundaries. It's going to be painful. Giving up Crimea particularly would be hard. And there's the problem that the Ukrainian constitution also puts some limits on what can be done here. But I think the really hardest questions are going to be about Ukraine's sovereignty, that Ukraine doesn't want to be in the position where the Russians get to sign off on how big their military is, how far their missiles can fly, when they hold elections, any more than we would want another country to be able to decide that for us.
Yeah, and those sticking points clearly remain. What did you hear about specifically today, the atmosphere of this conversation today, these talks today?
Well, I thought it was heartening a bit that when you listened to Secretary of State Rubio, he emphasized the importance of not only having a viable Ukrainian economy in the future, but having a way to assure that Russia could not launch this kind of attack again. And that means that they're going to need some kind of security guarantee. The Ukrainians are going to be naturally suspicious of this because they got one of these in 1994 from Britain, the United States, and from Russia. And it turned out to be pretty useless when they actually got invaded. In fact, even when they lost Crimea back, now 10 years ago. So I think the Ukrainians are going to really want to make sure that that is ironclad. And the Russians are going to want to make sure that, in fact, Ukraine can't survive as an independent state. It's Putin's desire to make sure that that state crumbles and gets rolled into Russia.
And as we look ahead this week, Witkoff, potentially Jared Kushner also expected to head to Moscow for these talks with Putin. And I'm curious what you think about this idea that they're making this progress with the Ukrainians. As Marco Rubio noted there, the Secretary of State, that obviously there's another party involved. Does Putin unravel any progress, or is this meeting with Putin is there a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back situation that they could find themselves in?
Well, I'm sure that Putin's going to want to push back because he's going to want to make sure that he ultimately has control over Ukraine's future. That's really what this is about. And the Ukrainian desire to join NATO and the European Union is to make sure that Ukraine and the West have control over Ukraine's future. So this is really going to be the front in the new Cold Wars here, because in the end, how this is resolved may well define our relationship with Russia. And I think one of the big concerns here is that the Trump administration, in trying to race to an agreement in time for Thanksgiving last week, you remember the president's deadline, was just trying to get it resolved under any circumstances. I think Rubio has now sort of retaken control of this negotiation.
Yeah. And in the meantime, Zelensky is planning to meet tomorrow with the French president, Emmanuel Macron. France, Germany, and the UK last week offering this counter proposal to the U.S. plan, which was essentially dismissed. How do you factor in Europe to all of this?
Well, the Europeans are angry, Jessica. They're angry because they first read about this proposal when it leaked a week ago. and they were completely cut out of this whole process. And I think that they believe that after all these different times that they have tried to work together with President Trump on these issues, set a common negotiating position with him before he met with Putin in Anchorage this summer and so forth. At every step along the way, they are kind of pushed to the side.
Do you think Trump has essentially sidelined Europe here?
I think he'd like to. I mean, it's an odd position here where President Trump has said to the Europeans, we expect you, not the United States, to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. We expect you to pay for their weapons. We'll supply them and sell them, but only in return for being paid by the Europeans. But he does not expect them to have a major voice in the outcome of this. And frankly, it's their security, in their view, that is also being negotiated. This isn't to the Germans or to the Poles or to others just about Ukraine. It's about where Russia stops and where they draw the line, and whether Putin has to pay a price for his invasion or whether he gets at least part of what he wanted.
Yeah. And to that, look, the Secretary of State is expected to skip this meeting of NATO's foreign ministers next week. We don't know why that is. But you have reported a lot about Rubio's influence just generally in Trump's inner circle. And so what does it tell you if Rubio's not going to that? What does it tell you about their priorities and their thinking here?
Well, I was a little surprised. This is a meeting that the Secretary of State usually goes to, and that's been the case across Republican and Democratic administrations. If it was just one example, I think people might say, well, there's a conflict or he needs to stay closer to Washington. But the U.S. just sat out the G20 summit because President Trump had objections to South Africa as the host. It has sat out recently of the climate change talks, and now this meeting. And so there's just this general sense that the Trump administration just does not want to engage with its allies.
We're joined now by Democratic Representative Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. Congressman, thanks so much for your time tonight. Always good to see you. I do want to start with these talks today. In your assessment, do you feel like progress is being made?
Good evening, Jessica. Thanks for having me back on. I wasn't in the room, so I can't speak to the veracity of what Secretary of State Rubio said. What I can speak to, though, is what Ukraine needs and what Russia needs on each side of the table and how America can help get the two parties closer together. On Ukraine's side of the table, they need three things. They need a secure eastern border. They need accession to the European Union, particularly for those security guarantees as part of the Lisbon Treaty. And they need freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. And America can help them get all three of those things, particularly by taking the Russian frozen assets and investing in the Ukrainian army so they can secure that eastern border, by not making them give up parts of the Donbass that they control, and by ensuring that Germany and France agree to allow Ukraine into the European Union immediately. On the Ukraine side of the table, actually, I feel confident that America and Ukraine can get pretty close. It's on the Russian side of the table that the president is falling down the job right now, though. He is continuously so weak on Vladimir Putin, and right now he needs to be strong. He needs to say to Vladimir Putin, forget about these Arctic mining deals, forget about joint investment vehicles. We are going to sanction and strike your oil refining and oil pumping capacity and send you back into the Stone Age if you do not end this war. But this president refuses to speak in the one language that Vladimir Putin understands, which is strength.
And listen, even some of your Republican colleagues were not happy with Trump's initial 28-point plan, which people said was too heavily weighted toward Russia and exactly what Russia wanted. Obviously, there has been some movement on that plan since then. But I'm curious if there's anything more Congress can be doing to get aid to Ukraine right now, to support Ukraine in this moment.
The 28-point plan was meant to be taken seriously, not literally. I mean, the Thanksgiving deadline and some of the points in there about military and territorial concessions were at face value laughable. But there were 20 of those 28 points that actually form the bolus of an agreement that Ukraine would be stronger and richer at the other side of. So I immediately said, let's work on this deal. It's obviously not going to happen in its current form, but it can be the basis so long as the president's willing to be tough on Russia. And that's what Congress needs to do. What Congress needs to do, particularly my Republican colleagues in Congress and the Senate and the House, who are much more hawkish on Russia than this administration is, but have stayed mute as this president has played sycophant, they need to signal that we would support taking Russian frozen assets from Belgium and giving them to Ukraine, that we would support long-range strikes of U.S.-made ballistic missiles against oil refineries around Moscow, that we would support sanctions against Russian oil-producing capacity, that we would support secondary sanctions to prevent India or China from importing Russian oil. Congress needs to indicate that we have a backbone, because certainly the administration will not when it comes to the Kremlin.